And I call the honourable member for McMahon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There was once a politician who campaigned across the country on cost of living issues. He went to every corner of this nation campaigning on cost of living issues. And he said to the Australian people, they want a grown-up adult government that's thought things through, that has a clear plan to protect people's job security and a clear plan to reduce people's cost of living. Well, we all know who that politician was. He holds high office in Australia now. He's the Prime Minister of Australia. He had a clear plan, all right. It just wasn't clear to the Australian people because he didn't tell the Australian people about it. He had a clear plan. He planned it all through, but he wasn't prepared to be clear with the Australian people about his plan. He campaigned right across the country on the cost of living for motorists. On the cost of living, he said, in one of those new age moments, for housewives doing the ironing across the country, showing he was in touch. He showed the Australian people he cared about cost of living. He just didn't tell them that he planned to increase their cost of living. He planned to increase their cost of living by increasing petrol tax. He planned to increase their cost of living by reducing the age pension. He planned to increase the cost of living by throwing young people off Newstart. He planned to increase the cost of living by increasing debt on tertiary education. He planned to increase their cost of living by an attack on their cost of living. That's what this Prime Minister planned. He had a clear plan, all right. He just wasn't very clear about it when he was campaigning for high office. He ran the most fundamentally dishonest election campaign in Australian history, an election campaign totally revolving around cost of living issues, promising to reduce the cost of living. And all he's done since, with every policy he has implemented, is to increase the cost of living on the Australian people. He says there's a modest increase in the petrol tax. He says it's small. Well, of course it raises $2.2 billion. Oh, very small. That's not modest, Madam Speaker. I'm the first to acknowledge that's a very significant impact on the budget, on the federal budget, but it's a bigger impact on the budget of Australian families. And as the Australian Motoring Groups have pointed out, by 2016-17, the average Australian motorist can expect to pay $142 a year extra because of this government's tax changes. Well, he campaigned against the carbon price, but he didn't tell the Australian people he was going to replace it with an increase in the petrol tax. He went off to the United States. He told President Obama, I'm good on climate change. I've got a carbon tax on steroids. And this is what he was talking about. He was talking about his increase in the petrol tax. But he didn't say, oh, by the way, that carbon price, that had compensation for low and middle income earners. That had a well-thought-through package. That said to people on low and middle incomes, we're going to help you as we transition to a low-carbon economy. But is there a compensation package for the petrol tax increase? Don't think so. Don't think so. No compensation package for low and middle income earners. It's okay to increase tax without a compensation package. Oh, but it's a terrible thing to introduce a carbon price with a compensation package. That's the warped and twisted logic we see from this Prime Minister and this Treasurer. This sort of warped and twisted logic which saw the Prime Minister last night at a function in Sydney, which I attended together with the Leader of the Labor Party in the Senate and the member for Brand, say to the Labor Party, join Team Australia, because you've got to be on Team Australia, and the way you get on Team Australia is to support our unfair policies. Well, what sort of warped and twisted logic is that? It's the same sort of warped and twisted logic that we saw from the Treasurer at that dispatch box, when he categorised Australian people. He split the Australian people into lifters and leaners. Well, that's not Team Australia. Team Australia is one team. It's not lifters and leaners. It was an insult to those Australians, Madam Speaker. It was an insult to those Australians who commit no crime but to work hard but need a bit of support. And I thought when the Treasurer said that, I thought that's just showing that he's not in touch with the aspirations and hopes of the Australian people. But I thought, well, at least it's original. At least it's original. Lifters and leaners. Lifters and leaners. I thought, well, at least he's come up with original thought. I have to say, Madam Speaker, I was wrong, because the Treasurer wasn't even original. He modified it a little bit, but the idea came from elsewhere. There's an organisation in the United States. Some members might have heard of it. It's called the Tea Party. It's called the Tea Party, Madam Speaker. It has some pretty extreme views, and it has adherents to its views who make statements about Americans. And there was a US politician. He's still a US politician. He's a high-ranking US politician, Madam Speaker. And he categorised the American people. He's a favourite son of the Tea Party. He was a Republican candidate in the recent presidential election for vice president. And he said this. He said, in America there's makers and there's takers. Makers and there's takers. That sounds familiar, Madam Speaker. Leaders and lifters, makers and takers. Straight out of the Tea Party copybook. But, Madam Speaker, I give Mr Ryan credit because he said that, he made that statement. He lifted it out of, admittedly, even he wasn't original. It came from Fox News originally in the United States. Even he wasn't original. But somebody came up to him. Somebody came up to Mr Ryan and said, I don't like that makers and takers categorisation. I think that's pretty offensive to Americans who need a bit of a hand. Are you saying my mother, who's a pensioner, is a taker, not a maker, after she's worked hard all her life? You know what Mr Ryan said? He said, you're right. I shouldn't have said that. I was wrong. It was insulting. It was offensive. I was wrong to categorise Americans like that, said Mr Ryan. I withdraw those comments, said Mr Ryan. He got the insult that he had applied to the American people. Do we see any such grace from this government? Do we see any such acknowledgement from this Treasurer? From this Treasurer who insulted the Australian people by providing them, by categorising them into lifters and leaders. He insulted the Australian people when delivering the federal budget. Does he acknowledge his error? No. He says to the Australian people, if you're poor, don't worry, you don't have a car. You don't drive, so don't worry about the increase in the petrol tax. Well, he withdrew that for a couple of days and then withdrew the withdrawal. Withdrew the withdrawal, Madam Speaker. So out of touch is he with the aspirations of the Australian people. But the most insulting thing of all, is not the Treasurer's words, it's his deeds and his actions. That's what's the most insulting. His words are insulting enough, but his deeds and his actions are the most insulting. This Treasurer, who was the sidekick of the now Prime Minister, going around Australia campaigning against the carbon price on his deep principles, which had been informed by a Twitter question some time before, Madam Speaker, when he'd asked Twitter for advice on what to do about carbon pricing. As the Treasurer has famously been known to say, I've got principles and if you don't like them, I've got plenty of others as well. I've got plenty of others as well, says the Treasurer, because he's good at plagiarism, is our Treasurer. But he went around the country campaigning on carbon price, against the carbon price and cost of living issues. And the Treasurer is the same Treasurer who came into this parliament and stood at that dispatch box and brought down a divisive budget, an unfair budget, and a budget fundamentally bad for our economy, because he is fundamentally out of touch with the Australian people. We've had a few Treasurers out of touch in this nation, and this Treasurer takes the cake. He makes Peter Costello look like he was a touchy-feely, in-touch type of guy. I've got to tell you, Madam Speaker, this Treasurer. He's got such arrogance that he lectures the Australian people about how they should work longer than anybody else in the world. They should work until they're 70. They should work. I'll check Hansard and see what you said later, Barnaby. You just be quiet. He tells the Australian people that they have to work longer than anybody else in the entire world, as he sits in his office bringing down this budget, which has fundamentally divided the Australian people and insulted those Australian people who work hard but are not of means. Because this is a Treasurer who is fundamentally driven by prejudice, in a government fundamentally driven by prejudice. As I've said before, Madam Speaker, if this was a budget and a government driven by ideology, I'd fundamentally disagree with it. If it was a coherent, well-thought-out ideology, I'd have my problems with it. I'd disagree with it, but I'd have some respect for it. I have no respect for prejudice. No member on this side has any respect for prejudice. Whether it be racial prejudice or whether it be prejudice against ordinary working people, we will not abide prejudice. We will not abide a Treasurer who divides this country into lifters and leaders. We will not abide a Prime Minister and a Treasurer who says one thing before an election campaign, who runs a fundamentally dishonest and deceitful election campaign and then comes into office and says, let's have a mature conversation. Well, I'll tell you what a mature conversation is code for. A mature conversation is code for Ignore my deceit. That's what a mature conversation is code for with this Prime Minister. Ignore my deception of the Australian people. I know I deceived you. I know I engaged in a fundamentally misleading election campaign, but now I want to have a mature conversation. Well, I'll tell you how you start a mature conversation. You start by admitting. You start by admitting that you lied to the Australian people in the election.
I call the